Hi, I'm Ben Porter. I'm the senior pastor of the Kirk of the Hills, and I want to welcome you to this class that we're calling Having the Mind of Christ in 2020. This has been a year like no other in recent memory, as everybody knows, and there are plenty of things for us to be thinking about how we look at them through the lens of the gospel. Our goal in this class is to talk about real issues in real ways, but to always keep the Bible as our anchor, never drifting beyond what we can say from the sure foundation of Scripture. For each topic that we talk about, we're going to have a panel of people who are experts in various ways on the topics. And our hope is to be able to edify the church and to build up people, yourself included, as you continue to get to know God better in the real world. So we hope that this is useful for you, and we hope that you enjoy as you watch. Thank you. Gentlemen, welcome. We're here today to talk about the physical and social effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And some of our neighbors are extremely concerned about the dangers that it represents to our health as individuals and as a community. Others of our neighbors are not nearly as concerned. In fact, some are fairly well convinced this has become a little more than a political chess piece. And lots of people in the middle are just kind of waiting for it to be all over, including all of the arguing about it. We probably won't be able to get everybody on the same page through one conversation here today, but we do want to spend a little bit of time talking about the issues and specifically talk about what it means to represent the gospel of Jesus Christ and to think about, in the middle of all this, how are we ambassadors for his kingdom? So that's our goal today. Let me just begin by, for the sake of our audience, introducing you. First of all, Tommy Hanna is with us. Tommy has graduated from Covenant Theological Seminary with a Master's of Divinity and is now doing research for a Master of Theology degree in preparation for pursuit of a PhD, which we'll be excited to learn more about in years to come. Dr. Dan Doriani is professor of biblical theology and vice president at Covenant Theological Seminary. Prior to that, Dan earned his PhD from Westminster Theological Seminary and served in a number of academic and pastoral roles, including as a senior pastor for right about a decade at Central Presbyterian Church right here in St. Louis. Dan has written many books, including several commentaries in the Reformed Expository Series, and is also a council member for the Gospel Coalition. And we have Dr. Jay Whippold with us, a member here at the Kirk. Jay held the position of professor of radiology and chief of the neuroradiology section at Mallinckrodt Institute of Radiology at Washington University. Prior to that, Jay served as chief of neuroradiology at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and with that served more than 20 years in the U.S. Army in combined active duty and reserve service. Jay has been consistently selected for inclusion by Best Doctors in America publication, was appointed a fellow at the American College of Radiology, and has served as president for Missouri Center of Bioethics. So this should be a fun conversation. Let me begin. Dan, I want to start with you, actually. I know you've been thinking about this. As I mentioned, we have to be careful about thinking that we can solve these issues through a little bit of discourse. These are highly complex issues. Maybe even thinking about solving them is the wrong way to think about them. But we also have to be careful not to give up on trying to develop our thoughts and trying to understand them, also trying to understand each other and even ourselves. So, Dan, as we think about what it means to have the mind of Christ, how do we speak charitably to people with people that we disagree with? Every issue for us as Christians is about more than the issue. It's about an opportunity to reflect the character of Christ. What advice, what thought have you given to the question of how we can balance our call as Christians to have a certain character with the fact that the issues matter?
Yeah, so about 100 years ago, J. Gresham Machen said that a real man, if you will, or a real woman, will fight about the important things. And he meant first order matters, like the deity of Christ and the gospel. And so we have to be willing to lay it on the line if someone is saying, The Holy Spirit is an impersonal force that kind of gives me ideas from time to time. But matters like COVID and matters that the early church addressed are secondary. And Paul writes really almost 2 chapters of the Bible just telling Christians how to disagree about secondary matters and how not to fight. And the secondary matters they had were 2. One was, do we have to do we have to keep the Jewish calendar special days? And do we have to avoid eating meat, or can we eat meat, which is possible? And so some people were saying we should be vegetarians because you can't be sure what was done with the meat, whether it's clean or not, and others said you can. What's interesting is that Paul spends most of the time on that discussion on how to discuss the matter, and 2/3, 3/4 of the way through, he finally says who's right. So to analyze his approach, we would say that Paul believed that it was much more important to disagree well than to have the right answer. Now, he gives little hints about where he stands. He calls one group the weak and the other the strong, so you get an idea. But he actually says a series of things, and I'm just going to walk through them very quickly from Romans chapter 14. So he says in verse 1, now we're talking about these debatable matters, and he says it's important, first of all, that we not quarrel over opinions, by which he means not primary matters, not the gospel. When Peter made a mistake about the gospel, he said, I opposed him to his face. But don't quarrel about secondary matters. And he says, look, one person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person thinks he can eat only vegetables. Let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains. And the tendency for people who are very sure that they're right is to despise other people. That's what Paul's labeling. You moron, you idiot, you poor and poorly informed, you with the wrong sources, you led by your emotions, and we diminish people. And the other option is that we judge people. So you can despise the one who abstains, the one who says, look, I'm enlightened, I know I can eat anything I want, and you have too many scruples. The person who has, the other person who says, well, no, I'm in the right by not eating meat, will judge the other person. And those are our 2 tendencies, to despise and to condemn. Despise and condemn. And Paul says, look, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another before his own master he stands or falls? That is to say, God is our master, God will judge. We don't get to judge each other, especially again on these secondary matters. Now that does not mean that we then say, oh well, who knows, we disagree, we have to respect each other. The next thing he says is in verse 6, one person esteems one day, one can eat meat, one can't. He says in verse 5 and 6, each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. That means even if I disagree with Jay or Tommy or you, and I say, oh my goodness, Jay's such an expert, Tommy's so studied up on this, Ben is my pastor, I still have to make my own decision. I can't lay down and say, oh, who knows? It doesn't matter. If the issue comes up, we should study it. And then when we draw our conclusion, we're convinced, we still don't despise or condemn or judge the other person. Now, Paul says a lot more. I don't want to monopolize here, but there is one thing he says at the end, and it still is talking about this issue of how we live when we disagree. In chapter 15, verse 2 and 3, he says, let each of us please his neighbor for his good to build him up. So our job is not to be right and to please ourselves and to think I won the argument. Wilson Benton used to say, nobody ever wins an argument. Nobody wins. You might score more points, but you don't actually win in the church. He says, for Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. So Jesus put others first. He didn't please himself, and indeed he bore reproach for us. And at times we might need to bear reproach as Jesus did and let somebody just be angry at us, because our goal is not to please ourselves. Mm-hmm. The goal is to please our neighbor. The goal is to please the Lord. And if we find ourselves in a conversation that's tearing apart another person or tearing at the fabric of the church, then we need to pull back, and we may just need to say, you know what, I'm gonna let you, I'm not going to argue anymore. I'm going to let you have the last word and please my neighbor instead of pleasing myself, by which we might mean, pleasing my ego that I won the debate.
It's hard to do.
Yes, it is. That's why I read Romans 14 pretty often,
Yeah.
because I've been in a lot of debates with people over the years, and sometimes you just have to accept that you're not going to persuade somebody at this moment, and it's better to respect them than to push too hard.
So let's do that. Let's take what you just said. I want to ask Jay a question specifically about COVID and where we are right now. And then let's come back to what you said and figure out how we do that in light of the current moment we find ourselves with this pandemic. But Jay, let's get a little bit of your expertise on the medical side. One thing we're all having to deal with firsthand, of course, is the widespread notion of wearing masks to protect ourselves and one another from COVID-19. And it's interesting to me, 6 months ago, I never in my wildest dreams would have imagined an America where everybody would wear masks everywhere you go. If I thought of a culture wearing masks everywhere in public, I might think of another country, but never America. Now, when I go to Home Depot, the only person I notice is the person walking down the aisle not wearing a mask. But of course, there's a lot of debate over what the right thing to do is, whether we should be required to wear masks, whether it's immoral not to wear a mask. Talk to us just from a medical perspective for a moment about why masks have taken center stage in all of this.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Ben, and I think we live in sort of a soundbite world now where people want a very simple answer that can be given in 5 seconds, and it's very hard to do sometimes with questions like this. I'd like to invite us to think about some cautions and caveats when it comes to just the issue of masks as foundational for what we might then think would be a reasonable way out of the dilemma. First of all, it's important to ask ourselves, what do you mean by a mask? There are many types of masks, from those that are very tightly woven masks to those that are just loose t-shirts that people have configured to wear, versus those that have actually been certified by the U.S. government, the N95s, N standing for United States certification, versus other countries' certification and so forth. So that's the first caution and caveat when anyone says, oh, masks. What do you mean by masks? Secondly, the question is, what are you trying to deal with in terms of protection? So we know now that there are probably 3 ways that COVID-19 is transmitted. The first, and probably the least important as it's played out, are what we call fomites. RNA particles on surfaces like tables and so forth. Probably more importantly is the airborne type of transmission, which comes in 2 different ways now, we think. One are large particle droplets, which are small drops of water from a cough that have thousands and sometimes millions of viral RNA particles, versus aerosol, which can hang in the air for hours sometimes, is typically very, very small. So the question would be on masks, what are you trying to protect from? And then the second part of that is, who are you trying to protect? So there are bodies of literature dealing with the protection of the source, or I shouldn't say protection, but trying to protect others from the source. Or if you are wearing a mask, what is the likelihood then of something coming through that mask and infecting you? So that's another caution. You have to ask yourself, what is that literature addressing before you try to delve and answer? I think a third caveat is there are laboratory tests that use computer models or mechanical devices, and then there's clinical tests. Boots on the ground. You have a population of patients, and you look and see. Some have masks, some don't. How did this work out? And so you always have to ask yourself, is this a theoretical type of research I'm reading that tells me what to do with masks, or more of a clinical research? Finally, and this is probably most important caution, there have been no established, double-blinded studies looking at the clinical use of the common masks we have now with COVID. So we have studies on masks, we have studies with other viruses, influenza, and we even have a few studies with masks and COVID-19, but they're not very good. So we don't have a lot of good data. So what can we distill with those cautions and caveats? Well, masks are probably helpful in source infection, in other words, wearing a mask to keep you, who may be pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic, from shedding virus, provided you're talking about the droplet, sputum, cough, and so forth. The N95 mask is a commercially available mask, is probably the best, followed by a surgical mask, followed by a cloth mask. The N95 is certified to be protective of 0.3 microns, thereabout, or larger. The surgical masks are less effective, probably 50% filtration, cloth masks even less than that. So that's something to keep in mind. Masks work best when they have limited exposure and you're not immersed in a very closed space for a long period of time with known virus particles. So that's something to keep in mind. They are probably best if exchanged frequently and kept clean. So they are helpful, but you need to specify what kind of a mask and how am I going to use it and what am I trying to protect.
Okay, so one of the things that I'm hearing you say is that we live in kind of an all or nothing culture. One day we're being told masks won't help. The next day we're being told masks are kind of the end all be all to protect society. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, and some of it has to do with how we think about science and the answers it is and is not capable of giving us. So people tend to gravitate toward the answer maybe they want science to give them. You know, if I have kind of a preconceived notion that I'd like to find the comfort of believing that masks will always protect me and will end the virus, then we should all wear them, and I feel strongly about it. If I don't like masks and I feel like having to wear a mask is a violation of my personal freedoms, then I'm not going to wear one, and I don't want anybody else to wear them either, for that matter. That's the state of affairs. So coming back to what you talked to us about, Dan and Tommy, how do we live in a COVID-afflicted world where we have some uncertainty about these things, but we have to make real-time decisions, and in some cases, we have to engage in debates and arguments. How do we reflect that Romans 14 character of Christ when people want to know, where do you stand and what's your decision going to be?
Yeah, I'll start with that. I mean, my first point actually would be, Jay, can I just make sure I understand what you said? So, sometimes you can question the expert. So what you're saying is that masks are probably helpful, especially with the larger particles, and those tiny little aerosols that can hang around for hours, they're not as helpful.
Right.
And it's probably helpful for everybody, but maybe if I'm infected, maybe I'm helping Ben more than I'm helping myself. And if I'm helping Ben more than because there's a study that shows once the virus gets in your mask, you could actually be worse off, right? So some people say, well, I'm not going to infect myself, but I'm not just self-interested. That's Romans. We're a body of believers, and so my job is not just to protect myself, but it's to protect you. And by the way, Tommy's in my community too, and he lives in an apartment space where there's a lot of people, a lot of kids, and so I need to watch out for Tommy. So maybe the first thing is I want to get the facts straight, and I don't want to get them straight for me only. I want to get them straight for my community and the people who are maybe even ancillary to my community through my friends. So we're a body. That's my first thought. And maybe I'll just stop there. Tommy might want to hop in. I have another thought, but I don't want to, monologue.
Yeah, I mean, hearing you talk and your introduction, I immediately think of what it means to love someone who may be more susceptible to either fear, anxiety, or the virus itself. And what it means to condescend, not in a negative or, hubris-oriented sort of way, but what it means to condescend to those who have greater need in love. And I think of the gospel. Obviously, we have a Savior who's done this to us. And so we should be able to do this to one another. And yet, there's so much division. Because you hear all these other narratives about masks that start feeding, maybe presuppositions or fears that someone has about wearing them. When we breathe out, we're supposed to be expelling, the particles that are in our lungs. This is just a narrative that I read recently, and it's actually probably unhealthy to be wearing masks, and that it sounds to me like a false narrative. It doesn't seem like there's any peer-reviewed articles saying the same thing, and yet somebody who's really uncomfortable with mask wearing might be attracted to that. So how does this conversation become about, well, the general information is saying that masks are probably good. In fact, more than likely, it sounds just from what I'm hearing from you say, they're more than likely beneficial. So erring towards that instead of erring towards things that may be seen as a conspiracy. How do we move the conversation forward with?
So I'll offer a theological perspective for a couple minutes. Somebody coined the phrase epistemological humility, and of course in research that's important, but it's also it's a biblical concept. So, God has the omnis and we don't, right? He's omnipresent, we're one place at a time. God is omniscient, we know more or less. The greatest expert in the world is deeply aware of the chasms of ignorance that they have. So God's omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, and we're none of the three. So for this particular gathering, for this dialogue, I decided to look up all the places where it says we know and I know in the Bible. And what I found was that most of the we knows are in the Apostle Paul saying, come on, we all know this. Things are difficult. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. And Paul probably has, half a dozen or so we know statements just in Romans and another half dozen or so in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And they're mostly along the lines of bedrock confessions of faith.
First order.
First order, right. We know that we're united to Christ. We know that we died with Christ. We rose with Christ. And so we live in newness of life. That's the closest one over in Romans 6. And that was a very rough paraphrase of what Romans 6 says. Then there's the I knows. And what I found when I looked up the I knows is that they actually generally come from a spot where somebody is wrestling with something and they're admitting that they don't know everything, they're confused. And then say, well, there's one thing I know. So like when Paul's in jail and writing about it in Philippians, which you spoke on, a year and a half ago, he's, is it better for me to stay or better to go? And then at the end he says, but this I know, that I'm because of your need, I'm going to stay in ministry. I'm going to serve the Lord in ministry, whether I live long or short. And he says, I know. If I could just turn to Psalm 56 for a minute, which struck me as one of the interesting I know statements. And it begins with trouble. The psalmist says, be gracious to me, O God, for man tramples on me. And all day long an attacker oppresses me, which may be how we feel in this COVID moment. Mm-hmm. And then verse 5, all day long they injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. And you know, somebody whose business is falling apart because of COVID and you've been shut down, or you know, maybe a young athlete whose aspirations to shine on an athletic field and get a scholarship. I mean, why are they against me? So we can identify with this feeling, and then he says to God, you keep count of my tossings, you put my tears in your bottle, are they not in your book? Then my enemies will turn back in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise, in the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I shall not be afraid. What can man do to me? So the first 7 verses are agony. I've got opponents. They're making my life painful. I'm being attacked. And maybe not everybody, the COVID experience. I mean, some people say, hey, COVID, not that bad. I've had a lot of quality time with my family, but a lot of people justifiably feel that this is tearing at the fabric of their life. And then this I know. So, I think we need to talk about the level and the limits of knowledge that a scientist has. As Christians, we can say there are certain things I know. God is for me. God is still sovereign. And then as a Christian, because we know that God has the omnis, including omniscience, and no human does, then we, and Jay has modeled this in public and in conversations with me, modeled epistemological humility. And I just remember that some people voted Isaac Newton as the most brilliant man of the last 1,000 years, from 1,000 to 2,000. And when he lectured at Cambridge, he lectured to an empty hall because he had the lecture, but nobody could understand him. And so he would just talk to the walls and give his notes to people. And yet the mighty Isaac Newton had to be corrected by Albert Einstein because there were features of his beyond brilliant description of the universe that were not accounting for all the data. And so if the most intelligent person in the last 1,000 years needs to be corrected, I guarantee you that we need to be corrected, especially when, we're getting new data every few days. So we know a few things. We're ignorant of many things. That's a scientific statement. It's also a biblical and theological statement as well.
So, epistemological humility. Mm-hmm. Epistemology is the study of how we know what we know.
Epistemology is a meta-study. It's not what we know, it's how we know. And how can we be sure that we know something?
So science, and I kind of want to ask Jay, because he's worked in this for a lifetime. Sometimes in this conversation about COVID, we will hear somebody say, that's your opinion, but we need to follow the science. And it's the end-all, be-all, because it's established through study that this is something we can know. But certainty, how we know what we know, is a little bit more slippery in the field of science than sometimes we want to admit, which is not to disparage science. Science is the study of God's creation, and we as Christians celebrate that. But working in a scientific field, the field of medicine, for a lifetime, how do you manage your relationship with what we can say we know for certainty, with certainty?
Well, Ben, I think the most important lesson I ever learned is that I can't really be as sure as I thought I once could be. And I think Dan said it very well when he said we get new data all the time.
Yeah.
And so to build on Dan's example, you have Isaac Newton, and we used his mechanics for centuries until we began to rub up against light and other things, and then Einstein came along and corrected. There are still some problems that can be approached from the Newtonian physics perspective and the Einstein physics perspective, and they both derive the same answers. But clearly, they're not the same in the way they approach, and Einstein built on that. So I think that's the first thing that we have to realize, is that to say that science establishes rock-solid truth is largely a myth. And particularly in the life sciences and the medical sciences, we almost have to go back to the Greek sophists and say, you know what? Truth is a probability. And when we read scientific papers, they'll make a claim, but then they'll often say the probability of this being chance is 1% or 5%. You say, well, that's pretty good, right? 99 or 95%, we're on there.
We'll take that.
But there's still a 5% chance it won't hold. About 15 years ago, a Stanford epidemiologist, John Ioannidis, wrote a hallmark paper, and I think it's up to a couple million citations now, on basically that most of what you read in science is false. And he had some elegant proofs to show that the assumptions made in many claims were just not true. And boots on the ground, you can't reproduce the findings that these papers were claiming. So the sticks supporting science were kind of knocked out from under with some of that information. That's later been verified, and we hear about medical errors and all the other things, which basically show we're fallible. So we have to read critically. We have to discern with the understanding this might not be the answer. And maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, more data will show that what we're now claiming as truth, maybe not so.
So that's where the humility piece comes in. I have to live today with what we know today, with a probability of what science can tell us is something we need to recognize. But the humility comes with knowing that tomorrow we may have a new study that supports maybe a contradicting theory. And that changes my character. And that feeds my ability to conduct myself in a Christ-honoring way.
Yeah, so can I just ask that you repeat the author and the title of that study for those who might want to catch it and read it for themselves?
Yeah, I don't know that I can quote the title, but if you would Google John Ioannidis.
I-O-N...
what is it? Ionnnaides, a nice Greek name, John Ioannidis, and he's been writing a lot about COVID. But if you Google John Ioannidis, medical errors, you will likely come up with a reference.
Thanks for joining us in the first half of our discussion on COVID-19 in this series on having the mind of Christ in 2020. Please come back next week as we release the second half of our discussion on COVID-19. And until then, have a great week.